Hello and welcome. You are listening to an informed take on current events brought to you by law students and staff of Queen's University Belfast. This is LawPod.
Hello and welcome to LawPod. My name is Deborah Mosso and I'm joined by Charlotte Gurley. This episode will be about racism in Northern Ireland and the Belfast protests which occurred in June in 2020 and the PSNI's handling of the BLM protests. We hope to open up a conversation about the inequalities and discrimination faced by minorities in Northern Ireland, specifically Black people. In this episode, we are joined by Cassie Logan, who is a law student from North Belfast and has been very vocal on social media in relation to the Black Lives Matter movement and also attended these protests. Tara is also an activist who attended the Belfast protests and spoke at the rallies. He has been very outspoken on his dealings with the PSNI and the way in which they showed bias in their handling of the protests. We are also joined by Sinead Marmon from Phoenix Law in Belfast. She will be here to provide a legal perspective in relation to the racial issues in Northern Ireland and has provided legal advice to protesters who were issued with fines during the June protests.
So the first topic we want to cover is the actual Belfast BLM protests. So Cassie and Tara, you were obviously there. What was the atmosphere of the Belfast protests like? How was the speaking at the protests?
The atmosphere was kind of like surreal because I've never really been to anything like that. And I didn't expect there to be so much support for it. So when I went down and you seen the crowd and it was absolutely massive, I think it was just really, really encouraging. And I felt like now was like the time, or like finally the time that came where people were starting to listen to people who have been talking about racial issues for years now.
And even though there was loads of people there was a social distancing, and it was well organized in terms of United Against Racism and the volunteers who had put their time to ensure that there was social distancing, and that there was also stewards to help people and remind people of the social distancing, so that people met the regulations, for COVID.
Yeah, I mean, even from videos, I was able to see, everyone was wearing their masks and there was social distancing. So obviously there was that awareness of, although they were out there protesting for something that was massively important, everybody's health also came first. And, I think there was a real awareness of that, which is why it was so shocking whenever the PSNI dealt with it in a way which has been so criticised.
Whenever, for example, when I arrived at the Custom House Square, there was just loads of police wearing the riot gear. Right. And, very heavy police presence. And even the way they were, like when I arrived, 2 police officers approached me and immediately started asking me, where are you going? What are you doing? If you go to that event, we will give you a fine and you'll be liable for prosecution. And
I said, okay.
Intimidating. Well, that was the intention.
It's very, very intimidating.
The intention was to intimidate.
And do you think the PSNI were particularly biased in their approach to the BLM protests compared to, previous protests? When did you realise this?
The 5th of June, right? At 11 o'clock, the MLAs met at Stormont and they passed a law. And the purpose of this law was to enable police to behave a certain way towards the Black Lives Matter. Because this happened on the night before the Black Lives Matter protest. So the atmosphere was set. And when the First and Deputy First Minister made statements where they were saying, where they were suggesting that people should not go and protest, people should protest at home, people should do their protest in a different way, in such a way that they were not, they were not cognizant, they're not taking cognizance of what the impact of George Floyd had done to the whole community.
And I think, those protests that had happened after, and it was either anti-mask or like those like statue protectors.
Yes.
They had happened after. And what kind of like really angered me was I was actually on TikTok and a video had came up of these like protests, but it was of a policewoman, and she was like in the middle of one of those protests, like laughing and joking. She wasn't wearing PPE, and she was joking with those protesters about standing and like about social distancing. So she was having a joke with them about it while not wearing PPE. And then it came out that none of those protesters had got fines, but yet BLM people who were social distancing and wearing PPE got fines.
I think before, as you said, Tara, that, you know, the law that was passed the night before, I think by doing that and by the actions of the PSNI, they had already set the tone for how they wanted to approach it.
Yes.
Do you know what I mean? So I think to them, it didn't matter that anyone was going to be wearing masks. It didn't matter that there was going to be social distancing. They had already determined how they wanted to approach it, regardless of the circumstances. And, you know, whenever, especially when there's such a clear difference between how they approached the Black Lives Matter protests and how they approach these anti-mask protests, when there's such a clear difference and such a clear bias as well, that's what really angers people. And, you know, it just really, really amplifies the message even more that the racism is there and you can't claim otherwise.
Yes.
Yeah. But you know, whenever the Chinese embassy protest took place on the 10th of June, and they were not social distancing, they were not treated heavy-handedly by the police. And then the protect our statues, which I think Cassie just mentioned earlier, protect our statues, they were not even wearing any masks. They were not even social distancing. In fact, they were fraternizing with the police, joking with the police. And whoever said in the Black Lives Movement in Ulster, in the north, whoever said that we were going to attack those statues? Nobody in Belfast ever said it.
It never happened.
So it's like people make stories up. Far right people make stories up. Some politicians make stories up, and they justify treating Black people a certain way. Was it one of a Lisbon councillor called Gavin, who was the mayor of Lisbon? He said the Black Lives Matter people are anti-family. They are anti-father.
I saw that. Yeah. I saw that. It's unbelievable, honestly. I think they really go out of their way to create these far off narratives, and people will just eat it up straight away without even, you know, thinking about it and maybe even trying to consider what we're asking for. And that's how these things happen, where, you know, the police deals with it in such a ridiculous way, and people have these, you know, far right views because they're just eating up whatever narrative is given to them without any sort of, you know, critical thinking.
Yes, but this is the culture that when you're Black, especially when you're African, and you have lived through 500 years of slavery, and we have been traumatized to such an extent that a lot of us have been beaten down. They're just so obedient. And the police know that, you know, this hostile environment that was created by Theresa May, this bullying, harassing, aggressive policing towards Black people. You know, there was a statistic that during COVID, they stopped about 20,000 young Black men during stops and searches in England. And only 20% of them led to something beyond the stop and search.
And that's where that, you know, over-representation of Black people comes from, you know, when it comes to police statistics and everything, because Black people, especially young Black men, they're so much more over-policed, especially with in a situation with COVID where even then they're still getting over-policed, you know, asking them, why are you outside? Do you know what I mean? So that statistic honestly doesn't surprise me whatsoever. So my next question really was, do you think that the PSNI's actions are a demonstration of institutional racism then, from the way that they went about it, how they handled the protests?
So we got the report from the policing board, and that already suggested that the PSNI may have behaved unlawfully and misinterpreted the law. I know Sinead knows a lot more about this area.
Yeah, so the policing board report basically stated that the approach was unlawful in terms of how the police had construed the regulations in line with human rights law, which effectively they haven't done, they didn't do, making it unlawful because, as we know, you know, human rights must be at the heart of any public authority's decision making, and any construction of the regulations, it should be considered at the heart of that construction. So the policing board confirmed that balance in that regard to the Human Rights Act in relation to the regulations was not done, specifically in relation to the right to protest and the right to freedom of expression. So as Tura says, the police board report is highly important in respect to that. But also what you're saying there in relation to the other protests is another angle that we need to think about in terms of the lawfulness of the protests. So I think we'll probably touch on this a bit later, but the actual policing, the protest on the 6th of June, Belfast and Derry, strikingly different from those other protests that you've mentioned. The messaging of the police and the policing on the day wasn't really there to protect the public. It was more as an adversary. The role was very, adverse to protecting the public. And then you have to look about discriminatory policing in that regard when you compare it with other protests around the time. But I think Tura's been talking about this recently, but that's supposed to all come out within the police ombudsman's report, which we're all awaiting for eagerly. And there's significant delays in that.
Yeah, I have a quote here from John Wadham, who's the human rights advisor from the policing board. And it says here that he stated the PSNI approach sent the wrong message to protesters and damaged the reputation of the PSNI and the confidence of some of the members of the public. And I think that's exactly right. I mean, at the end of the day, as you said, when he said sent the wrong message, the message was, like you said, that they weren't there to protect the public. Rather, they were there to act as a hostile force and just really show like a really biased approach when it came to how they dealt with it.
Definitely, and I think that was very much how it felt on the ground for a lot of people too. Two of my colleagues were down on the day, and I was kind of waiting by the phone. Here, Mona and Dara Mackin were down arguing with officers about construction of the regulations and whether it was lawful. And certainly, from what they say, the police didn't really understand what they were enforcing or how they were enforcing it, how their actions may have been actually extremely unsafe. And people were reporting like a lot of bottlenecking at entrances and exits because police were preventing people moving in a uniform way that was highly organised by the stewards and the organisers. So in fact they actually created an unsafe environment when it could have been it was designed properly and organised properly to run smoothly.
Yeah, I think what would have been a really safe and well organised protest became unsafe, which I mean, really, you do have the PSNI to blame for that in relation to the bottlenecking and all the rest.
You also notice that if you look at the tweets from the PSNI during that period, they were sending conflicting messages. The PSNI was sending, 1 minute, Alan Todd, one of the senior officers, says, we will not be prosecuting protesters. And the next thing, another senior member, Robert, says, we will be prosecuting protesters. And the next breath, the Prime Minister is saying, we will not be prosecuting or giving fines to people who are going to be involved in peaceful protests, And so these conflicting messages at the highest level.
Yeah, that was definitely apparent. It seemed to be that there was some sort of decision made on the day or the day before about how to actually police the protest, because I think on the 3rd of June, to correct me if I'm wrong, but there was a tweet put out that from the 3rd of June protest at the City Hall, it said it would be a waste of police time and resources to spend all these hours processing any potential infractions of the regulations. And that was removed. Isn't that right? That was taken
That's right.
down.
It's taken down.
Yeah, and it was taken down. And then in the police interviews I attended, I referenced it and said, look, you're giving a mixed message to the public, and this makes these interviews even more ridiculous and unbelievable.
Yeah.
That the public have a legitimate kind of expectation not to be pursued, from a high level police officer, and then the next minute they're in a police station being questioned about it.
So, Sinead, from a legal perspective, would you agree with the Equality Commission NI that there should be a race law reform here? And could you explain how that could be done?
Yeah, they definitely think there should be a reform. It needs to be something that is implemented quickly and in tandem with the general public awareness, which has been raised this year specifically about racial inequality in Northern Ireland. Because, I think it's fairly apparent over the past few months that it certainly needs looked at. But at the same time, it can't be cursory, it can't be tick box exercise, it can't be just to please people. It needs to be actually meaningful.
That's exactly true. That's exactly true. Sinead, you just said something there that is meaningful.
Yeah, it needs to be meaningful. It needs to engage the wider communities who are on a daily basis discriminated against, not taken seriously, but even arising out of the fact that the police, I mean, our race hate statistics are through the roof, and that's only for people that report it. I've dealt with clients who've reported race hate crimes and they haven't been investigated by police properly or investigated at all. So I think there needs to be an overhaul and a complete review of how everything goes on. But I think here we're very much obsessed with our own internal issues and communities, and
it just shadows everything else.
Everything is so green and orange here, I think.
Yeah, no, it really, really is.
There's no room for any other thing or color. That's all anyone ever concentrates on.
I sort of say that it's not only this little island, which I call experiment colonialism A.
I know it's so true though, and I think when it's something that's so deep rooted, and at the same time it gets so overshadowed by other issues as well, it's so easy to sweep under the carpet for people that aren't actually experiencing it. And Sinead, like you said, I think a complete reform is needed for, like you said, anything meaningful to happen.
What is being reformed? There's been nothing. There's been nothing. So, the Race Relations Order 1997, am I right, Sinead, in quoting that?
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
Since the Equality Commission was established, the most successful thing that the Equality Commission has achieved is to get a nominal for the chief executive. Evelyn Collins and the Equality Commission are part of the matrix of the status quo. I'm saying this as a person who has experience of dealing with the Equality Commission. Yeah. The Equality Commission is a toothless dog.
Just not committed to any real change, any meaningful change.
Because it's part of the problem.
Yeah.
The Equality Commission, right, has not done anything significant for the advancement of race legislation in Northern Ireland. If anything, it has managed to keep the status quo. Race relations have got worse since the Equality Commission was established. The Equality Commission is not a trusted organization by people of color either. So people don't report.
Yeah, and Charlotte, you had a statistic there about, I think it was out of all the hate crimes that are reported, it's only something like
17% resulted in prosecution or a warning to the offenders. So that meant that 83% recorded race hate crimes did not result in a prosecution or even a warning to offenders. So Sinead or Tura, why do you think that is?
Because the government at the highest level is not committed to race relations, because the government is institutionally racist, because the people at the top of the government and the people who are running the government, leading the conversations, racism conversations, diversity conversations are being led by the perpetrator of those inequalities. That's the equivalent of having the Nazis running post of Germany and post-Europe. Post-Europe transformation. Like this whole issue of the Finucane, for example, the whole issue of the Pat Finucane inquiry. You have somebody like Brendan Lewis, the Secretary of State, saying that he will not establish a public inquiry at this time. And he's excluding the possibility that, there might be in the future, but at the minute I'm excluding a public inquiry. And he's suggesting that, the reason for this is because the PSNI and the police ombudsman are involved in some fact-finding investigations. And then the next breath you hear Chief Constable Byrne say, I'm not doing any investigation. And then you hear, Miss Anderson saying, we're not doing an investigation. Yeah. And so Brendan Lewis, the Secretary of State, is involved in shape-shifting the conversation and ensuring that the conversation doesn't deal with the real critical issues of oppression, subjugation, slavery, and colonialism. Do you know what Nuala Olone said? She says, I don't think the British government has an appetite for an inquiry.
No, and they don't. They don't. Sure, why would they? Because to have an appetite for an inquiry, that would mean actually taking responsibility, which we've seen time and time again that they refuse to do. So why would they?
Where would they? That's what happens. That's what happens when we have the perpetrator being the judge, jury, and executioner. These things have to be taken to an international court where these powerful families and powerful institutions who are implicated in these types of inequalities can begin to be held accountable. And I'm saying that British government, the police, the PSNI really behaved in a manner that was hostile and has been like that for a very long time.
It's nothing new. So no. It's nothing new whatsoever. And I think the reason that the hostility was there at the end of the day, because they feared the change that people would actually bring with the protests, and they fear that reformation that everybody's calling for, because they know at the end of the day, the people that are at the very top, if that reformation happens, then they lose the benefits of being privileged. Do you know what I mean? And they lose the benefits of being able to oppress minorities and Black people in the United Kingdom and in the rest of the world, of course. So that's where that comes from, is that fear of reformation, because they know that it won't benefit them in any way whatsoever. It will disadvantage them.
Would you countenance the idea that, after the French Revolution, 1789, after the French Revolution, and Britain didn't have a revolution, that somehow Britain managed to stay in a semi-feudal state in terms of even, when you go to France, there's this kind of freedom about being in France. And in terms of even the access that Black people, African people have to cultural spaces in France, you're more likely to hear African music blasting in France, in Paris, than you are in Belfast, than you are in London.
That's really, really true, because at the end of the day, if you're blasting African music, then you may as well be opening yourself up to some sort of verbal abuse, or you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because you can nearly expect it, because that's the tone of, society here. And that's what, really blows my mind, when people can turn around and say that, oh no, racism doesn't happen here, because it does. And, we experience it every single day, and we're aware of it every single day. So for somebody to be able to say that racism doesn't happen is just because they're privileged enough to never have to experience it in their life.
I think as well, there's just from what, my recent experiences are, clients who have come to me with, racial issues. A lot of the things that they say, and a lot of things I hear, is that, calling people out as racist seems to be more offensive than the racism itself.
Yeah, I know. People,
And,
people will do anything not to be branded a racist.
exactly,
They will
and
do anything.
I think it's like maybe a symptom of, our over politeness, or in
Yeah.
terms of not wanting to say anything, or
Shame.
potentially just
Yeah.
shame. Yeah, exactly, sure. So that's something I've heard quite a lot recently, which is just,
It's so true.
yeah.
So, Sinead, would Phoenix receive a lot of cases concerning race discrimination in NI then?
So my sort of area would be, I would deal a lot with immigration and asylum work, and would be dealing with obviously legal issues arising out of the Black Lives Matter protests. So a lot of the clients I have generally are ethnic minority clients, in quotations, and so arising out of that, people might come to me with, issues of race hate issues and not being taken seriously by the police, and then we also have actions against the police department as well, in terms of where crimes aren't investigated properly. So, through that kind of work, I see a lot of racial inequality issues. Specifically, I mean, I'm more immersed in immigration cases, asylum cases, so I see how immigration laws as a whole, and generally the whole system, are racist and designed to be hostile, which then pervades into society and society's views of people who are seeking asylum, for example, or wanting to get out of the immigration system, obtaining citizenship. The way the laws are structured around that are inherently, in my view, inherently discriminatory towards generally people of colour. Yeah, I suppose at Phoenix we represent people who generally are, against the state. So a lot of public laws are focused. So we see a lot of cases in general where people are challenging the state, which is never easy in any context.
So, Cassie, I wanted to ask you, I think that we often find that conversations around racism are really centred in the US. And do you think that that leads to, an erasure of conversation about racism here in Northern Ireland? And does that lead to people starting to believe that it doesn't happen here whenever it's so focused in America?
Yeah, I definitely think that. I found that with even when the George Floyd protests were happening here,
Mm-hmm.
people were you were asking people, why are you protesting? And they were
Uh-huh.
coming back with, oh, I'm protesting against police brutality in America, which
Yeah.
is what we were there for. That is one part of it, but you're also protesting. BLM is so much more than, just police brutality. It's it should be for everything. And police brutality obviously is a top priority because it's so bad. in America, but I feel like a lot of people dismiss the racism that happens in the UK and the US, and obviously because I think it's more like, because it's not videoed here, you know, they're just videos of police brutality over and over again, everyday racism that happens here all the time that we will experience isn't videoed. They just believe that it's not happening. I think that just comes from obviously a place of ignorance, a place of privilege. And I don't think people mean it. Like, I don't think they mean like, oh, I'm just, you know, protesting for police brutality. I just think here is just woefully ignorant, and people just believe because it's obviously like 99% white, because racism isn't happening to them, that it's not happening here at all. And because our police aren't out there, you know, like pushing black men to the ground, or I can only really, you know, I don't even want to say that because I know the police brutality happens in the UK, but I think because we don't see videos of it happening in the UK over and over and over again, people are just so inclined to be like, oh, you know, this country is racist. We're not racist.
I think when you compare how racism manifests itself in the United Kingdom as opposed to places like America, obviously there's similarities. At the end of the day, it is racism. But I think when you compare how it manifests itself, there are differences. And I think that's what often leads to people either saying, no, it doesn't exist, it doesn't happen, or they'll say, you know, oh, it's not as bad, or, you know, as I said, it's just kind of brushed under the carpet and it's just seen as sort of, you know, white noise that people can so easily ignore. You have to realize that racism, it's not always just violence. There's, you know, there's institutional racism, there's structural racism, there's racism within the workplace, there's racism within schools, do you know what I mean, in education. And I think when people don't educate themselves on that, and whenever they don't go out of their way, it's something that if you are in a place of privilege, it's so easy to ignore. Where it comes from, where people start to center it in America, because it is so violent, and you know, it's something that you actually physically see happening.
I think they look at like the racism that happens here, because it isn't as violent, it's less than, so then therefore it doesn't matter.
I would take a different stance, though. You know, during the war for independence in Africa, we were fighting all the European colonial countries in the 50s. These countries like Ghana started getting independence. And then the war intensified for independence against these imperial powers in the 60s. And the civil rights movement in America is happening. So these things happening parallel, they are happening. Remember the Brixton riots. Remember the 2011 Mark Duggan riots in London. Tottenham, London, all over the riots. There's always police brutality in the UK. And I have cousins who were at the age of 17, he was thrown into prison for a year. I know kids, black children, who at the age of 11 in Belfast, they have had handcuffs put on them. So I know that these young African kids that age have been brought in for questioning in the police station at Musgrave. These things are happening. They're not being recorded. They're not being challenged. I know, as my job now is working with the African community as capacity building officer. And I can tell you a dozen incidences where police just abuse people. I'm not going to call myself a victim, but I have been on the receiving end of the institutional racism, misandry noir, the anti-black man. I tell you one small example I had in one awful experience when I was 26 at the Equality Commission. An old woman accused me of asking her to sleep with me. And she went upstairs and said to one of her colleagues, oh, this black guy, he said this to me, but I don't want to do anything about it. And then she didn't know he was my friend. He came down and said to me, Tura, you wouldn't believe what happened. And he told me. And I said, no, man, you must investigate it. It was investigated and they found it to be inconclusive. And I said to the chief executive of the Equality Commission, who is still the chief executive, Evelyn Collins, I said, can I see the statements? It's not a matter of just telling me that it's inconclusive. Can I see the statements of what everybody said? She refused. She refused. And this new commissioner, I wrote to her 2 months ago and I said to her, look, I've never settled my heart because you know these Karens accusing black men of trying to do all sorts of things, you know. As a black man, it's like this, we are supposed to be rampant and uncouth and
aggressive
and oversexed beasts. And we are treated in this way all the time by the system that fails to understand and accept its responsibility in dehumanizing us, our women, and our people.
And I think that example that you said is just a classic example of somebody knowing the power of their own privilege and using that as a way to oppress.
Yeah.
So I mean, she knew, she knows her as a woman of her age and as a white woman, her turning around and accusing a black man, a young black man, of saying something like that to her. She knew the impact that that would have. So
I never took part. I never again
Uh-huh.
took part in. I was my 26 years old. I never again took part in anything involving the Equality Commission until this year.
Yeah. And why would you want to?
It feels like, I'm going to use this example and people don't like it. It feels like every time I'm going to ask for help from these people, I'm going to my abuser.
Yeah.
I'm going to, I'm going to the person who's been abusing me, and I'm asking them to have compassion for me and to find solutions for me.
And I mean, it's like you said, at the end of the day, you can't expect the Nazis to fix Europe after the war, because at the end of the day, the oppressor isn't going to fix the issue for you.
Well, I think it's damage limitation and shame. Nobody wants to be called a racist. Even Boris Johnson, as much as he is a racist, he will never come out and say, I'm a racist. And the thing is, it's not really important in whether or not he says he's a racist, because we know what we know.
We know that he is. Yeah.
Yeah, people don't want to fix a system that's benefiting them.
Yeah, exactly. That's where the whole, keeping things as is and people being far too comfortable with racism, how the system is so rigged against people of colour. They're so comfortable with it because it benefits them. So why would you want to change something that's gonna benefit you?
If you don't like it, you can leave. Like Harry and Meghan.
So Charlotte, I think you're going to ask questions about just social media then.
So obviously over the past months, everyone has been using their platform to spread awareness about the BLM movement. So Tura and Cassie, how much has social media had an impact on the BLM movement in recent months?
The capture of what happened to George Floyd by social media and the way that just went viral. And even prior to that, there's been other murders, of other lynchings of black male and black women. The social media has allowed these things to be exposed. And so it has been the vehicle with which particularly your generation, Cassie, has been able to use it to raise awareness. And I think I have to take my hat off, because I'm 47 and I've been doing this for all my life. And when I see young people like Cassie and Angel, her cousin, my daughter, doing this, I just feel, I feel it's so hopeful now that there's a generation that is educated and realizes that they've got to take back the streets. They've got to take back the country. They don't have to ask for it. And they're assertive in the way that they make their point.
So would you say the death of George Floyd was the wake-up call many people needed?
I think it was the way he died. I think it was that moment of seeing, that man lying on the ground and
calling for his mother,
and saying, I can't breathe. And then people saying, can you not see the man can't breathe, man, do something. And the nonchalant look on that police officer's face.
I definitely think his death was like a catalyst for a lot of this, because I've had so many people, like even members of my family, kind of saying I wasn't really aware of BLM before George Floyd, which I don't know. I thought a lot of people were. Like, I thought kind of everyone knew about it, but maybe that's just me being naive. But I definitely think his death would be, a catalyst for a lot of it. Social media, I think the way, like Tara was saying, like the way he died, it was so violent. And I think, there is people that say that sharing those videos isn't doing any good, and that you shouldn't be watching them. But I think I have to disagree with that. Like, I think, why not? Although it's so unpleasant to see, but that's what's going on in the world. This is what reality is.
Yeah.
This is how Black men and women are being treated in America and around the world. Like we just said, Tara said, in the UK as well. Like, this is what's going on. And how privileged are you that you're sitting at home in the comfort of your own home on your phone watching it, and you're like, oh, I don't want to watch it. There's people that are in the streets seeing this happen. That's people's sons, that's people's daughters.
And if you don't believe what has happened to George Floyd happens every day to us, here is the 6th of June.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Exactly.
Uh-huh.
I mean, it just blows my mind a wee bit because the fact that you were out protesting and you experienced exactly what you were protesting against.
Yeah.
It's just it's crazy to me.
Out in the
Mhm.
open, and
Yeah.
and this is the thing about social media. It is so hard for politicians to hide behind, because if you say something this year and think you can
Mhm.
say something different next year,
Yeah, you can't.
they'll play it back
Uh-huh.
for you and say, hey.
Yeah. You can say something this year, and in 10 years, someone will pull it out of the archives and hold it against you. So you can't get away with it anymore. You really can't.
And so maybe it is a seminal moment. I was at a webcast once, and one of the politicians says, the 6th of June is that moment where all of a sudden Northern Ireland realizes that, damn, we are racist. And this
Yeah.
is how we do it.
Yeah.
And this is how we've done it. I've spoken about how, I'm a policing family. So I hope that other young people can become policemen. They can be helping promote the good relations in the community. They can police with integrity. They can bring positive policing into the community. It will not happen under the system that we currently have. The
Uh-huh.
system that we have, that we are trying to solve these problems that are part of the system, is not going to create. We need a root and
Mhm.
branch. It needs to be root and branch. And a new system where these colonial system or these colonial narratives are not able to even play out.
And I think people are so shocked whenever they hear people say that classic thing of defund the police and, we don't need reformation, we need to do away with it completely. But
Yeah,
I mean,
revolution.
yeah, at the end of the day, how is change going to happen under a system that's working exactly the way it was designed to be working?
I think that your generation must actually begin to say, we know how things work in Northern Ireland. We know
Hmm.
how Good Friday Agreement comes, and then St. Andrews comes, and then they have a racial equality strategy, which is published just before Martin McGuinness, in 2014. It's supposed to start from 2015 to 2025. And then 5 years later, only 2 of the 11 things that are supposed to be achieved have been partially achieved. It tells us that the politicians do not have an appetite for diversity and equality.
When it comes to people having been unaware, I mean, you can't be unaware of it now, but having been unaware of the movement, do you think that that came from a place of genuine ignorance and genuinely not knowing what was going on? Or do you think that it was more of a case of it was more comfortable for them to ignore it whenever it wasn't all over social media and it wasn't on the news? Or, was it both?
I think it's like a mixture of both.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I think they're ignorant, but I also think because it doesn't concern them, they don't
Uh-huh.
care.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Because they're not black, they're not the ones, getting attacked in the street or really racially bad things, like really
Mm-hmm.
racist things being said to them. They just don't care because
But
this place isn't that diverse.
I come from Zimbabwe 27 years ago. I live here in this country. I speak Gaelic. How many people in this country speak Gaelic?
Exactly.
Uh-huh.
People
You're
in this
definitely in the minority when it comes to that.
And
now
people,
you don't even know their history in this country.
Mm-hmm.
Never mind, they don't even know about the famine. They don't even know that at one point Ireland had 10 million people. 10 million people. Where did they all
Yeah,
go?
yeah.
If they
Gone during the famine.
Yeah, some
Mm-hmm.
died, some migrated. So
Yeah.
migration is normal. But the racist narratives that are permeating this country are
Mm-hmm.
historical.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people have been educated. I know myself, I've been educated through social media on certain terms relating to racism, such as microaggressions, formative activism, and white privilege. Cassie, could you explain what these terms mean and maybe explain just some ways that we can go beyond just posting on social media about these problems and actually, help the community?
so with microaggressions, like some that have happened to me is like, so I'm biracial, so obviously I'm mixed,
Mm-hmm.
black and white. So a lot of people would say to me, "Oh, you're not really black," and I'm like, "What does that mean?
Yeah.
What do you mean by that?" And what really irritates me with that is because they associate blackness with like negativity. So if I do something, they're like, "Oh, that's not very black," or
Yeah.
or I'll get like the opposite where they're like,
Mm-hmm.
"Oh, you're so white."
Yeah.
I'm like, "What does
Yeah.
that
I
mean?
know that's
Like, I
such a
don't
classic
get
one.
that.
Yeah.
What are you
Mm-hmm.
talking about? Like, what
Yeah.
what is it to be black and what is it to be white? Because
Mm.
what you associate blackness with is not what I associate it with. I associate
Yeah.
it with power, with greatness, with, being smart, with change, with
Mm-hmm.
revolution. you're not associating blackness with that. You're associating it with being a thug.
Black is bad and white is right.
That they really, really irritate me.
I was just going to say, I was working in a clothes shop in Gannon and I had to do a refund for somebody and he told me his name and he asked me, do you need me to spell that for you? And I said, no, it's okay. And then he said, oh, well, you must be very educated then. And to somebody who doesn't get the undertones of what he said, you know, it might just seem like an offhand comment. And I think it goes back to this whole intention versus the impact. So I'm sure maybe he didn't intend it to come across as a negative comment. And to him, the conversation is probably completely forgotten. But it's always stayed with me because at the end of the day, the impact with me was that you took one look at me, you saw that I was black, and you assumed I wasn't going to be educated enough to be able to spell a common Irish name. And I think that comes from, you know, those biases that are so programmed into everybody constantly. It surrounds you in the media and in the news and everywhere. And that's where that comes from, these microaggressions. So like I said, yeah, exactly. People are socialized. He sees black and he equals that to uneducated, which is, like I said, that's where all these microaggressions come from. And you know, you face it every day. I mean, that was about a year and a half ago, and I had a really similar conversation maybe 3 weeks ago in an Uber, where my driver turned around to me and he said, "Oh, you don't sound like I expect you to sound." So it's constant,
Everyone always
constant.
thinks when they meet me that I'm going to be American.
Yeah.
Like, what are you talking about? Like, I'm
Yeah.
like, why would I be American? I work in a clothes shop as well, and
Yeah.
a girl she actually accused me of stealing first, and she described me as the coloured girl. And then another guy was like, I don't know if you're from here. And I was like, why would I not be from here?
Yeah.
Like, why would I not be Irish?
It's so crazy to me whenever people think that way because, I mean, knowing how diverse Northern Ireland is and how much immigration there is, to turn around and assume that and yeah, there is a lot of immigration here, but to also equal somebody who's grown up here for most of their life or were even born here and to tell them you're not from here, you don't look like you're from here. I think you can't turn around and say it anymore, you don't look Irish, because Irish doesn't look one way anymore.
What does an Irish person look like? Because according to half the world, they're all really pale skin and ginger, and we all know
Yeah,
that's not true. And I would get said,
absolutely.
like, where are you from? And I'm like,
Hmm.
Belfast. Like, and they're
Yeah.
like, no, but where are you
Where are
actually
you
from?
really from? Yeah.
Do you know what I
Yeah.
mean? And it's unbelievable. I'm like, why
Hmm.
can't I be Irish and be black?
Hmm. And what ways would you suggest in terms of people looking for other ways to go, you know, beyond social media and beyond sharing the infographics? How can people, you know, in their everyday lives try and actually make a change?
Have this type of conversations.
Family, when they say something, correct your family and friends. When they say something wrong, correct them, tell them,
Hmm.
you know, what's right.
Yeah. I think people are really afraid of confrontation, and that's where the whole, you know, staying where you're comfortable and not wanting to have conversations that might be uncomfortable, but then that's how things don't change.
I always
Hmm.
say, like, if you feel uncomfortable having the conversation, think about how comfortable I feel when I have, you know, women and men twice my age coming over, petting me, petting my hair like I'm some sort of dog, implying that I'm not from here, you
Yeah,
know,
it's so
saying stuff like
dehumanizing.
slavery.
Hmm.
You know, that's how uncomfortable I feel. So
Hmm.
you, for 1 second, you need to, you know, get out of your head. You saying that you feel uncomfortable having a conversation with someone that's close
Hmm.
to you, it's not good enough anymore.
People have to be made uncomfortable. The whole system has to be made uncomfortable.
Hmm.
I was at a conference yesterday, which was hosted by the Arts Council, and they asked me to speak about my experience of racism in the Arts Council. And I told them. 2 hours later, they were saying, "Can you please give us the name of the person who did this?" And I told them. And my hope is that Arts Council, if they don't pull their socks, they may actually be slapped with lawsuits, because
Hmm.
at the prime of my dance career, I was stopped from accessing funding because of my slant on Irish culture, because I do Irish dance, and because
Hmm.
I have a certain take on culture. And
Hmm.
I was punished for over 10 years. I haven't received any funding from the Arts Council. So, and when we talk about this institutional racism, a lot of people don't actually see how it actually plays out. So
Hmm.
I want to invite Cassie and yourself, Deborah, and all you
Hmm.
guys. We must have debunking clips. We must be able to challenge some of these notions, challenge some of these leaders and actually do things that actually say, you know what, we're not going to believe you anymore. We're not going to do as you say. We're going to take over the streets. The streets belong to us. Stormont belongs to us. And if you guys don't get your act together, we're going to elect people on the BLM ticket to go to Stormont. And until people actually say, okay, we are going to have a BLM ticket for people who are going to implement the race equality strategy at Stormont. So we're going to get as many people with the BL or BAME, whatever, LGBTQ. We must have people who can articulate the issues and concerns of people of color and people who are minorities.
Yeah.
But I tell you, the current parties in power at the minute, very few of them are capable of doing it.
I wanted to ask you, Sinead, within government and the law, going off of what Tara said there, how can the law be changed to protect Black people and other minorities? Is it a case of, it's not just the law that needs to be changed, but the people that are enacting those laws, which I think everyone can agree that that's a huge problem. How do you think that just the whole legal aspect of it, how can that be changed to provide more protection for people of colour within the United Kingdom?
Within the UK, or do you think specifically in Northern
In
Ireland?
Northern Ireland, yeah.
I think, well, as Tara was saying there about the racial equality strategy hasn't been met, I think a lot of lawyers in Northern Ireland have been advocating for a Bill of Rights for a very long time. And I think perhaps racial equality issues and recognition and, building on racial equality strategy should be formulated within any Bill of Rights. And I think that that's potentially the best way forward in terms of any legislative change in Northern Ireland. It would be via a Bill of Rights. And also, that's legislatively, but if we think about how we can change it, now would be our challenge. We are doing challenges arising out of the protests at the minute, things that are very, very slow with courts. And I can't comment too much because of ongoing litigation. But things like our challenges in addition to that are important too, because we are holding the bodies to account, like PSNI, to account in their decision making. And at the heart of that has to be a human rights based approach. Ultimately, that will be, for the High Court, hopefully shortly. We're just again at the mercy of the court, as I said. But, challenges like that, challenges against police decision making, challenging other bodies like the Home Office or things like that in terms of court. But ultimately, that means an individual has to take that authority to court, which is never going to be easy, and it ultimately falls on the shoulders of one individual who has already been, put to a detriment of some sort. So it's a very difficult thing for an individual to have to do, but ultimately it is generally in the public interest. So we have a mechanism of our courts to do that, as well as, as I mentioned, the Bill of Rights in a legislative way.
So, Sinead, could you see law firms here adopting certain programs to ensure the representation of minorities in the legal profession? Do you think BLM has changed the future of law firms in NI?
I'd like to think so. I mean, I certainly know that whenever I was doing my training, I can't think of anyone who represented an ethnic minority community. Generally, our legal profession isn't hugely representative or diverse, but there is a group that's been set up through the Law Society quite recently, arising out of the Black Lives Matter movement. I think generally, not just the legal profession, but I think companies and firms and businesses across the board have taken into account the need for diversity and the need for recognition of racial inequality as well. And I think people are getting better at it, and I'm certainly going to always advocate for it if I possibly can. And I know others, like-minded others, will do too, and certainly our firm does as well. And I think that now is a good moment to push and advocate as much as we can.
I think, like Tara said, for things like that to happen, it is a team effort at the end of the day, because you have people who can use their privilege to help others bring about that change. Like, I mean, I had this statistic from the Law Society where this is for England and Wales, just only 3% of qualified practice law are Black.
A Black lawyer, and you think, I just think representation is so
It's so important.
and I've never seen myself reflected in court, or you know yourself, I've been down, doing work experience. When you go in, nobody looks like me. like
Yeah.
nobody looks like me. And even kind of when I tell people I'm like, oh, I study law, they're like, really? You don't
Yeah,
like
no, I'm the
study law?
exact
I'm
same.
like, what are
It
you
is
doing?
they're like, really? Oh,
Yeah,
that must be
like, really?
hard.
They're like, you can't even think
Yeah,
you would study like fashion or something.
yeah, it's very condescending.
Like,
So it is.
not that
Have
there's
you
Yeah.
anything
seen
wrong with being
the book of
fashion,
the
but
barrister Alexandra Wilson,
yeah, I love
Yes,
False
that.
I follow
Dominion?
her too.
Yeah, I love
Yeah,
her.
See.
Yeah, I've been meaning to buy her book actually.
Yeah, I really want to get it. I think my mom's getting me it for Christmas because it's
Yeah,
so important to like see yourself represented. Because I've never seen a black barrister until I went on Twitter and found her,
yeah.
and then I was
Because
like, so
how I found
excited.
her was actually from her story saying that I think in one day she was a barrister in court. She was mistaken for a journalist or for somebody who was there, like in their own case
Yeah, I
that
think
had
she's
been
like
arrested.
mistaken for a defendant, and they told her to get out.
Yeah.
Like she was
Uh-huh.
told 3 times to leave the court.
Yeah.
She's like, no,
And
I'm
there's your
barrister.
perfect example of a microaggression happening right there to somebody who's so fully qualified, and it shows you that you can get so far up, and those biases are still going to be there regardless of where you're at.
They look at you, they look at how you look, and they're like, "Oh, she can never be a barrister. That's not
Yeah.
what barristers look like." And I'm like, "Well,
Mhm.
why do barristers all have to be, like old white men? Like
Yeah.
that's all people
Mhm.
think of when they don't even think of women. Mostly,
Yeah, I know.
they're like,
Yeah.
"What? A
Well,
woman lawyer?"
but one of the things. What I ended up doing is I ended up studying law,
Mhm.
and I graduated at the Open University. And my immediate point after graduating was, what am I going to do? Go to the
Yeah.
bar? And then I said to myself, I will have to deal with the institutional racism and
Yeah.
old boys network of the bar. I am 47 years old. I've got no appetite for that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And nobody can blame you for feeling that way. You really, really can't. I know. Yeah, it's the type of thing where it's like you know what you're in for when you're in a situation like that, when you know that you're going into such an established institution and network of people, you know who you're going to be dealing with.
Because that's where
And
the
mhm,
racism was legalized.
yeah,
And
exactly.
and,
Yeah.
and and one of the funny things about it is that if you were to look at how the legal system in the UK has developed, it's not a crime to be racist.
yeah,
It's not a crime to be racist. I mean, come on. It has to be accompanied with a criminal act. What ludicrous racist idea, or in terms of even natural law, it doesn't even make sense.
yeah.
Mhm.
And I think even we were doing like moot. We were kind of like deciding outfits and whatever else. And someone asked me, "What are you gonna do with your hair? Like it's kind of
Mhm.
crazy looking." And I'm like, "This
Yeah.
is my hair because my hair isn't straight, down my back. Like what do you?" And then
Yeah.
that made me feel weird, so I straightened my hair for it. I didn't. That's like another problem that I'm saying probably all women, because I remember one of my human rights lawyer. She was telling me a story how, as a woman, she faced discrimination because she wasn't allowed to wear trousers. That was years
Mhm.
ago. But I think as black women, one of the problems is if you're becoming a lawyer, you're thinking about things like your hair and
Yeah.
other things,
Mhm.
because that does have an impact. I often think that people see my hair before they see me.
Yeah, and I think with black women, you're dealing with the misogyny as well as the racism.
Yeah,
You know what I
definitely.
mean? You've got both things to deal with
And it's the
from all sides.
that aggressive black woman tag that's
Yeah, the
always
stereotype. Yeah.
constantly put on
Mhm.
me. Constantly,
Mhm.
24/7, I'm either called a bitch or I'm too aggressive,
Yeah.
or, I am a very passionate person. I'm very passionate about these subjects. Just when I'm talking, like I remember getting into debates, even in like uni, and we're getting
Mhm.
into debates and they're like, "Oh, calm down."
Yeah.
And I'm
And
like, "No, I'm just
why
so
don't you tell
passionate
somebody
about
else
this.
to calm down?
Tell
Uh-huh.
the fully grown man beside you to calm down.
Yeah.
Don't
Mhm.
tell me."
Yeah.
I was
Go
just going to say,
ahead.
hopefully you take that forward and start changing things. You're in the right time to do it, and I think it's definitely what the profession needs is more diversity and more
Yeah.
fighting, more people ready for a fight.
Yeah.
Well,
Exactly.
through my work, I've set up an African diaspora legal group, and in it, there's a judge from Sudan who's now in Belfast. He's now a legal expert. He was a legal expert in Qatar, and he's part of the group of people who are sort of looking at and trying to help some of the members of our community, because you have no idea how many black men are getting into trouble for just talking to a white woman in Belfast.
Yeah.
And a few of them are refugees. And there's just, people don't have social skills to even know how to behave, because, you know, if you behave a certain way, you'll be considered criminal behavior.
Yeah.
You know, you know, if you be considered uncouth and you know, a savage.
Yeah, unruly.
Unruly.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, unless, I think there has to be some way that young people like yourselves who are studying law can begin to interact with some of the, what is the lady from Gambia's name, the law lecturer at Queen's?
Dr. Brunger.
Ah, Brunja.
Yeah.
She's a firebrand.
That's what I mean when I say representation is so important, and it's so important to have these conversations. I feel like we haven't even got into half of what we could have talked about. It's such a complex issue, and it's so important to have these conversations and hear both the side of, you know, a black person who has faced, you know, that oppression in every aspect of their lives, and then to also be able to turn around and say to a white person, this is what you can do and this is what you should be doing, you know, going beyond social media, even just within your own homes and within your own family. So I think this conversation's been really good. It's been so productive, and I'll be really excited to get it out there, and hopefully it'll help a few more people that are on a mission to educate themselves more and try to, you know, unlearn all these biases that they've been so socialized to have.
Need a
So
revolution.
yeah,
I'm ready.
exactly.
I'm ready for a revolution.
Exactly. So hopefully this will be a part of it,
This is
and
part of it.
it'll inspire people to maybe go a step further. They'll take on board everything that was said by yourself and Cassie and Sinead.
Guys, volunteer with your communities. Give them competent skills so that they feel comfortable and confident in Belfast, and help them find ways of navigating some of the social narratives that are orange and green.
Well, there's another tip. So again, I just want to thank you all for agreeing to become a part of this. And I think the conversation that we've had here is really, really great. So thank you
You're
to
welcome.
Tara and Cassie and Sinead for joining us. And we'll see you next time.